Hi guys, today I had the absolute pleasure of sitting down with Mr. John Dykes. I've had the pleasure of watching him as the face of football for many, many years, as a broadcaster, as a journalist, and now as an entrepreneur. I hope you enjoyed the chat as much as I did. Cheers. Good morning, John. How are you?
I'm very well, Paul. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Now, before we dive in, I just want to ask you a little bit of a question. I know you've sat down and interviewed global icons like Serena Williams, David Beckham, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's one of my idols. What kind of insights can you give us about that little teaser?
You've done your homework, haven't you? Obviously, yeah. I knew you would do. I'll give you a little teaser about that. I think where we're probably going to go today is we're going to unpack a career of mine, which is quite weird. Because how often would you find yourself saying you've interviewed Schwarzenegger and one of the Williams sisters and David Beckham? So I think that will speak to the kind of areas we're going to get into today. But seeing as you asked it, I think what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about a career progression that was based around the fact that I took so many learnings from different people. Fundamentally, it was be good at your job, be respectful, and people will give you what you're looking for. And that is, you know, in the Serena Williams case, it's all about having a growth mindset, about always wanting to improve. In Schwarzenegger's case, it's about earning the respect of somebody and then understanding your purpose in life. And in David Beckham's case, it's very much a question of having a very true sense of what you are, what your brand is, and where you can go. So we've gone in heavy, but in a way, I think we're going to come back to all of those.
Please. Now, for the very, very few people that don't know who you are, can you just give a quick synopsis and a quick intro?
Wow. Okay. Well, it depends how old you are. Simple as that. And I'm not going to second guess when you might first have come across me. But a very quick synopsis. I'm no youngster. I started off I'm a media person, basically. Started off living and working in Hong Kong. Worked for the South China Morning Post newspaper, where I was very lucky to work my way up the ranks from junior reporter to sports reporter to feature writer to editor. At the same time, I started working in television. Curiously, I started in TV and entertainment, movies and showbiz, hence the Schwarzenegger reference. But I'd always been a sports guy. And I went back to sport when I started working for Star Sports, then in Hong Kong. Star Sports merged with ESPN, brought me to Singapore in 1997, and things really exploded. We became the biggest regional player, one of the world's biggest broadcasters, and I was lucky to present every sport under the sun. But being an Englishman and being a football expert, they bought the rights to the Premier League Asia-wide, and I was invited to be the host of that, which I did very happily for a number of years, not just Premier League, but predominantly. And then the Premier League itself took note of what I've been doing and hired me to go to London for 7 years to work on the brand new content service, which was a global thing for broadcast partners, which you will see, and you see to this day when you watch it. Yeah, in Singapore, we watch it on StarHub, and so on. So I had that 7 years in England doing that. But for one reason or other, which we'll probably get into, I came back to Asia in 2017, worked with Fox Sports, who gave me a show with my own name, The John Dykes Show, which was 3 times a week. That ran for about 4 years, but then sadly, Fox was shut down by its new owners, Disney. And since then, I've basically pivoted career-wise into still doing a bit of media work, but moving much more into speaking, hosting, and a bit of coaching.
Amazing. Well, look, let's just unpack this. How does a young man come from Essex and get to Hong Kong? Where did the odyssey start and how did you get there?
As with so many people, this wasn't a case of I had a job in Hong Kong for a month and stayed for 10 years. No, my father was a banker, and Dad was a working class Geordie. He came from Ashington, which was the home of the Charlton brothers, and he moved to London because his dad was a builder, and they went down to rebuild London, the capital, after the war. So Dad, as a teenage Geordie lad, went down there. And he, one way or another, he found his way into banking, but really from the bottom level up, you know. And he learned and he worked hard and he joined Citicorp. So he was with Citicorp all his career.
Wow.
And he pioneered really something which would be very commonplace today, something called loan syndication, in which what he would do is largely he would go towards governments or institutions around civil engineering projects, and he would put together a syndicate of banks and he would lead it. Citicorp would lead it. And so he was doing that for years, traveling the world when I was growing up. And I went to a boarding school in England as a result of that because Dad was away a lot. And then he got a posting to Hong Kong, where he became managing director of something called Asia Pacific Capital Corporation, which did what he was doing, but just did it around the region. And out he went to Hong Kong. I followed a little bit later, having finished my A-levels in England. did terribly in my A-levels.
Did you? Why? If you went to boarding school, you weren't studying, or?
I was playing sport all the time. I was hopeless.
What were your favourite sports growing up playing?
To play, I was a runner, so I ran cross country and I ran track. And as I got older, I was a bit of a late developer, but as I got older and bigger, I really enjoyed running like 400 meters, 200 meters on the track. But I played football without ever really being into football, so I've got no skills. Anyone will tell you if you've seen me play football.
Oh, really?
I can run around and I love a tackle, but I'm not going to keep a ball in the air.
Isn't that ironic what you ended up doing?
It's really funny that, yeah. I actually preferred playing rugby. I like the physicality of it. I like being able to tackle, offload, running, anything to do with movement. But I did everything. Honestly, Paul, I played squash. I was on the gymnastics team. Sport was everything for me. And I think in boarding schools especially, that was important. When I went to Hong Kong, I did like an A-level retake here. I was lucky enough to get into a little offshoot of the island school there, which was called South Island School. And at that time, they had nobody. And their campus was in an old school down in So Kom Po, where the National Stadium is. So we were in there. I had like private tuition in the subject I retook and a new one I took, which I did great at. I passed them. But I spent the whole year playing sport. I played league cricket Saturday, Sundays. I was very keen on cricket. Played for my first 11 at school in England and all that. Loved it. Did that. And I was on the cross-country team, the running team, all the teams, the rugby team. I just played sport non-stop, but aced my exams, qualified for uni.
Yeah.
Went back to England. Hated it. I was doing an English literature degree. I couldn't see any point and purpose in it. But I started working on the college radio station because I was really into music. I still am. I love music.
Okay.
And I did a sort of indie alternative rock show, which I loved. And then I realized I could speak and I could do media stuff. They sent me to do some interviews. And I thought, that's it. So when I got back to Hong Kong, I did some radio internships.
So you knew you wanted to go back to Hong Kong. You had a yearning for it.
When I was in England, Mum and Dad were great. They got me back to Hong Kong as often as they could.
But you were in Hong Kong during its prime, right? I never went there back then.
Amazing times, and there's a temptation with anything to do with Hong Kong to always be nostalgic about it.
Yeah.
But genuinely, from the mid '80s through to the mid '90s, because I stayed there in the end until '97.
Wow.
Ironically, just before the handover, purely coincidentally, just for the job.
Did you? What was the experience of flying in back in the day?
Kai Tak?
Yeah.
Kai Tak was nuts. I mean,
I've seen the videos.
Yeah. And the thing about it was when you were coming in, you knew when you got to Beacon Hill and there was that sign and then you just tilted and and it was true. You could see into people's living rooms and you'd see the bamboo with the laundry on and everything like that. And where we lived, because, Dad was fortunate to be a banker, we lived halfway up the hill in the mid-levels. Beautiful. We were on the 36th floor of some beautiful building there. And he would sit on the balcony and because Dad literally just traveled all the time, we'd sit there and we could see the runway at Kai Tak and he would say, oh, that's, Cathay flight so-and-so from Manila coming in. Oh, that's the United LA flight, what have you. He just knew them all.
Well, if you don't mind, just touching on this, because we've got kids, right? And yours are now starting to get to work and at uni. Yeah. But what I've said to my kids, my oldest is 17, is you want to go away and try and study abroad if you get the opportunity. Yeah. And ideally get your first gig working when you're young, because if not, you stay, you get married, that opportunity may never come up again.
Yes. And one of the things I was really lucky about, we were living in the countryside in Essex. I loved it. I was a country boy. I was running around all the time, went to this boarding school where I played sport. And I wasn't a very cosmopolitan, urbane kind of guy. I was a bit rough around the edges. But Dad traveled all the time. And when Dad came back, he always brought things back, whether it was a terrifying tarantula from the Amazon that he had in a case, or he'd come back with these amazing. He used to go behind the Iron Curtain and tell us stories about being in Russia or Eastern Europe and what have you. And he'd bring back these drinks, which of course him and his mates would get out, over a Sunday lunch or something, and these incredible vodkas from that part of the world. So he always instilled in us this belief that travel was the best thing ever, that opening your mind, broadening your horizons was great. So when we went to Hong Kong, it just seemed to fit and it changed all. I've got a brother and a sister. We all ended up in Hong Kong for a period of time. My sister ended up then going to New York, to work there. And it was just fabulous for us.
So how did you get started? What was your first job after finishing uni?
Well, the tricky thing was when I went back to Hong Kong initially, I there wasn't really anything for me permanently. So I did a little bit of freelance copywriting. I taught some English for a while. I did a little bit of the radio work on an internship. But fortunately, I then, thanks to a friend, I got into a little publishing company. I got a full-time job, but it was a trade publishing thing. And they used to do these things where they would write, it was like an industrial thing, but it was mainly China trade.
Okay.
So I was in charge of the advertising department. So it was a funny little company down in Wanshire, and I did circulation. I helped out with circulation, and I did copywriting.
Okay.
But the copy would be, you'd receive an envelope from the, Heilongjiang import-export, heavy machinery department, and it would literally be 3 lines in English: for all your needs in tractors.
Really?
Heilongjiang import blah 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 blah, and it'd be a picture of a tractor, and they'd say, right, make an advert out of that. So you had to come up with something and then put it in the magazine. Wow. And it was great fun. But the guy who was editing the magazine at the time, and they also spun off into a computer magazine, so they had a little bit of a stable. He went and worked at the Morning Post. And he'd taken a shine to me, and he sort of said, look, I think I can get you a job.
Was he a local guy? Or
He was a Canadian guy who'd gone into Hong Kong and worked. And he was lovely. And he said, look, there's a vacancy going, but it's as a kind of a trainee reporter on the junior edition of the paper. So they had this thing called Young Post, which was a school's edition.
Yeah.
So I went in there, and they trained me up. But because I'd been very visible around the sports scene, a lot of the guys on the sports desk knew me from playing the cricket at the weekends, and I'd been running, I got to the sort of, reasonable level running for the schoolboys, and I did a bit of rugby and all that. People knew me, and so the sports desk sort of said, do you want to come over? So, dream job. So next thing I know, I'm on the sports desk as a cadet reporter, covering...
How old were you then?
So early 20s.
Wow, so you got
early 20s by then, right?
Yeah.
So I'd never trained as a journalist per se, apart from on the job. I'd not done a journalism degree or anything like that, but I found myself there learning on the job. I covered the local rugby, I covered the local cricket, and because, as you know, places like Hong Kong, you can fast track. Next thing I knew, I was being sent to Manila to cover Davis Cup tennis, Hong Kong against Philippines. I was interviewing Kevin Keegan when he came through town. So things happened. And what was lovely about it was I was doing that, and a fellow called Spencer Robinson, who was our sports news editor, and he then became very famous for doing golf around Asia, as a journalist and in other guises. He said to me one day, he said, I think you have a nice flair for writing feature articles. And he sent me off to interview the Aussie cricketer Greg Matthews, which I did. And he said, yeah, it's a nice piece. He said, I'll put a word in for you on the features desk. So they came to me and they said, yeah, we like the way you write your features. Come and work with us on all topics. So next thing I knew, I put sport aside, and I was interviewing politicians, authors, celebrities. I was writing pieces about Hong Kong society.
Wow.
I was doing entertainment, and it really broadened.
Trial by fire. I mean,
you
threw you in at the deep end, right?
Yeah.
Did you find yourself pinching yourself, especially when you were interviewing people like Kevin Keegan?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, because what would happen is, the sports thing was fabulous. In the space of 2 months, I interviewed Sugar Ray Leonard and Marvin Hagler.
No way.
Now, I knew that would appeal to you.
Oh, is this before they fought?
That was after they fought. Both came through Hong Kong. And it was organized by an amazing guy called Derek Curry, who was probably the most famous international overseas footballer in Hong Kong history. He turned up there amongst the first players to ever play as foreigners there.
Okay.
And he had this beard and this long hair. He was a Scottish fella. And they called him Yazoo, Jesus, they called him, which was his nickname, which was so funny. But he was a really great footballer. And he ended up playing against Pele a couple of times. He went and played over in the States in Major League Soccer and everything like that. Incredible to think that he did that. But he became the PR manager for Carlsberg, which was a smart move. And he pushed all their sports events.
Wow.
So he would arrange things like he sponsored the Davis Cup tennis team. So that's why I went down to Manila. They covered the cost of that. He brought the boxers into town.
And were they together? Or?
No, separate.
Yeah, separate. I was going to say, otherwise.
So he just called me up one day and he was like, hey, Dykesy, guess who's here? And there's a picture of me with Marvin Hagler with the classic.
No way.
Just on his jaw and him rolling in that. Yeah.
Amazing.
So it was a very Hong Kong thing.
Yeah.
It just seemed to be that there was always a star in town.
Yeah.
And, and I tell my kids this, my daughter's funny, my 24-year-old, she says to me, I think I've heard all your stories and then you give me another one. And that was because the other day I told her that I sat and had a drink with Chris Isaac one day when he was at height.
No way.
And then the next week I'd be interviewing John le Carré, the author, one of my favorite writers. And then maybe a comedian would be in town. So there was always something.
Now, like when you think about, when I talk to people in their careers, moving from one line of banking to another to them seems daunting. But for you, it's real time, it's live.
Yeah.
Wimbledon, the Premier League. How did you adapt between the two?
So I mean, I don't want to ramble on too long. I went from feature writing into TV. So my intro to TV was a really interesting one because I'm from a sort of punky background. I like sort of punky music, and I like alternative music and loud music. And then being a journalist, and being British, I think a lot of us, we were always raised to be a little bit sort of anti-establishment and a little bit sort of edgy about stuff. So when someone first came to me from TVB, which was the big English channel there, TVB Pearl, and said, look, I was writing film reviews by this stage. I was doing my sort of film critic thing. And I was writing.
You weren't doing a Barry Hearn, were you? Not that way.
Barry Norman.
Barry Norman.
That's right. So you're a boxing guy. Barry Norman. Well, kind of.
He wasn't the most kind at times.
No, he wasn't. And I'm afraid it was tempting to be a little bit British and a bit cynical. And I think we're a bit raised like that. It used to be, we're the best. Our TV's the best. Our adverts, our music, everything else sucks. Someone came to me and said, look, would you come on the TV and do this? And I honestly turned around and said, what? Look at a camera and talk? That's cheesy. That's not me. What have you? Honestly, it was embarrassing. And they said, look, no, honestly, we think you could do it, So I went on a TV show. And the first thing I did, I said, look, you can interview me, but I don't want to be the presenter. So they interviewed me, came back to me and said, look, our producer said, well done, but next time you got to look at the camera and present. So I did, and one thing, Paul, that's really important in anyone's career is you just got kind people that help you along the way.
Yeah.
And a couple of really kind people, a fellow called Paul George, who sadly is no longer with us, was the presenter, and he gave me a few pointers, and then I became their resident film critic on TVB. Then I became the showbiz guy, and again the madness of my life, I would get sent to the junkets, the press junkets.
Really?
So when Jurassic Park came out, I'm flown to LA, where I'm put in a Beverly Hills hotel, where you basically, what they do is all the press are brought in, and then they wheel out the stars. So you sit in a room, 2 cameras set up, and then in comes Michael Crichton, in comes Jeff Goldblum, Laura Dern, Sam Neill, and you interview them. They flew me to Tokyo, which is where I met Schwarzenegger. He was promoting the Twins movie with Danny DeVito.
Oh, my.
And you're in a room and you're interviewing Arnie.
Yeah.
This is when you pinch yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I had this crazy career. But after a while, I sort of started thinking, I miss my sport. What's my pathway back into sport? And it just so turned out that I'd been at the newspaper a long time in various guises. And I thought, I'll go full time on the sport. I started doing a little bit of commentary for Star Sports, and at the same time I took on a day job working for a company called World Sport Group. And what they did was they had the rights to show, they owned the rights to Asian football production. They were the sort of the agency for Asian football, basketball, and golf, and they put out some content around it, an Asian football show, golf show, etc. I went in behind the scenes, not on camera. I went in as a kind of junior assistant to the producer, learning how to literally just make stories, log tapes, go on shoots. And then they asked me to make a show, which was an all sports show about Asian sport. And again, just sitting in edit suites, making a show, scripting, doing that. But at the same time, I was starting to do work on microphone, commentating on sport. Then Star Sports started putting me on camera, hosting anything from 5 nations as it was then, rugby, to Formula One, to football shows. And to finally answer your question, I had to learn. I was lucky. When you come from being a journalist, you've got the fundamentals. You know how to find a story. You know how to tell a story. You got your 5 W's in terms of structuring a story. So you know how to really hit hard and then taper off your story. So those skills were in me already. But I had to apply them to actually talking to a camera and verbalizing it. So what I needed to, again, very kind people. There was a director called Phil Betts, who's an Aussie guy who's probably the most famous sports director around Asia. He gave me a couple of pointers about how to be on camera, how to look to something when I wanted the audience to realize that I was throwing to a package. It's something I do to this day. Movement on camera, Paul, is really important. So if you're interviewing 2 guests or 3 guests, you have to make sure that their eye line is always on whoever's speaking. You'll see this in a panel on stage. Any of your, anyone watching or listening to this who goes to a conference will know that if in a panel one person is just gazing around the room, it's very distracting.
Yeah.
So the key always is, if I'm talking, look at me. If you're talking, look at that person. And what I learned from these guys was keep the audience's eye on you. So if I'm now going to say, well, let's listen to that interview I did earlier with David Beckham, I'll just do a little eye movement, maybe down or off, and then they'll know, oh, he's going somewhere. And then a video rolls, and it's seamless. So little things like that, projecting your voice, keeping your head still.
Just out of curiosity, did you watch broadcasters that came before you and say, right, I want to copy some of those traits and integrate that into my...
I think not directly, but I think you'd be a fool not to understand that you have to learn from people. So I grew up and I was just a sports nut. So it was always watching, back in England, it would have been the midweek football shows, it would have been Match of the Day, it would have been whatever I could watch. I was a big cricket fan, so I'd always watch Richie Benaud on the cricket and people like that. So I think subconsciously they were very much in my mind. The minute I started broadcasting, I watched actively. I made a point of saying, look at me, I'm using my hands. What do people do with their hands?
Yeah.
What do you not do? What are the no-nos here and there? So I started learning. And of course, again, I was picking up notes all the time. But what you have to do, absolutely must do, is watch it back.
Yeah.
And take criticism. And it's the most horrible thing.
Yeah.
Anyone who's ever listened to themselves back and go, oh, God, do I sound like that?
I know.
Or watch themselves back. I say that. You realize that you have, words that are crutches that you go to whilst you're buying time to think.
Yeah.
You have gestures that you didn't know you made. So you've got to be brutally self-critical. And that's how you do it.
Well, later on, when we come back to your coaching, that's one of the key things I want to touch upon, because senior executives really look at that. What I found, in sports is if you take the best athletes and what they do, you could see just a shadow of them and you would know, okay, so for example, that's Boris Becker serving. You could see a silhouette, you would know. And I think sometimes in whatever field that you've chosen, you need to have that expert knowledge in your industry. But what I find is people know more about sports because they love sports, they're passionate about sports, than they do about their own industry, i.e. in banking and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something interesting about that. When you mentioned passion, some time ago, somebody interviewed me and a few other presenters when I was at ESPN about why we did what we did. And I found two of them, I didn't like their answers. Two of them said something like, well, of course, first and foremost, I'm a fan. I'm passionate about sport. But my belief has always been, first and foremost, I'm a broadcaster.
Yeah.
That's my trade. Now, of course, anyone in that field will be a fan of certain sports, what have you. And today, you're encouraged to be a fan, I think overly encouraged, to the extent that people are taking fandom or considering more important than actually knowing the basics of broadcasting or the journalism behind it. No, I think you absolutely have to be a really good broadcaster, and then you work within the topic. And then if you want to show some passion for your sport or fandom, great, that's fine.
Yeah.
But first things first, be the best you can be. And I just wanted to go back a little bit there. There's a story I tell about the person who said something that I think influenced what I do, and it influences what I do to this day. Not just sport, not just broadcasting. The doyen of Aussie cricket commentators was Richie Benaud. So we're going back a long time. Former Australian Test captain, and this very sort of straight-faced guy who used to appear on BBC when I was growing up, and then on Australian stuff. And they always used to take the mickey out of him because he always used to wear like a beige or a cream or an ivory, or it was always it was just a brown man, in terms of the way he looked. But he was so clever when it came to broadcasting, and he's very famous for saying, if you haven't got anything to say that improves on what we're all seeing on screen right now, don't say anything. So he was very much about brevity when it comes to broadcast and just being absolutely right. I was lucky enough to meet him when I was starting out, and my producer said, this is John, and the guy was so lovely. He said, yeah, I've heard of you, I'm aware of what you're doing, because I did a lot of cricket back then, and we met at Lord's of all places, and he took a bit of time to talk to me, and he said something that has stuck with me ever since. He said, right, here's the one thing I'll give you today, John. He said, the secret to great commentary, particularly color commentary or co-commentary, is this. He said, you need to answer a question just as it's beginning to form in the viewer or the listener's mind.
Wow.
And you can see where I'm going with that. What that means is it becomes an organic experience. We're watching something in sport, but because we have a degree of expertise and knowledge, what we're going to do is we're going to show you as the audience the respect to understand that you're beginning to notice something, but perhaps you can't articulate it yet. And we're just going to step in there and go, well, as you've been noticing, this bowler is doing a lot of that. And the reason he's doing that, or she's doing that, is because of this. And what happens then is it becomes an organic process in which you're engaging with the audience, you're empowering the audience, and everyone's getting that, yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
That's great. And it's a predictive, progressive thing. And I've applied that, Paul, to every single thing I do in my life. I'm not talking down to an audience. I'm not simply firing stats at an audience. I'm saying, hey, let's go on this journey together. And we're going to bring stuff to it that's going to enhance your experience of what we're doing here, and we're going to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think that's, to this day, that happens in everything I do.
So powerful. Well, actually, in doing research for today, I watched one of your recent clips where you were talking about the top 5 volleys of all time. And I actually hadn't watched your number one. But to your point, you made a point very interestingly about how the player was actually headed in the other direction. And it was something that, unless you looked at it multiple times from different angles, you wouldn't have thought about. And that's brought the skill level of that shot to the next level, right?
It is, absolutely. And I think that happens with all sorts. So I just said that absolutely, and I'm annoyed with myself for that because that's a bit of a crutch word, and too many people say that. But you know why we have those words? It's because it buys us a split second of thought.
I call them transition words and phrases. We all have them, right?
Whatever it is, we do it. And that's one that a lot of people use. That example you chose about the volley, and it was, not a very well-known player, but it was a piece of skill that was amazing. Demonstrated something which I think is very important in sport. We've all played a little bit of sport, and whatever the sport may be, we have an understanding of it. But what I've always tried to do is when I'm sitting opposite a really famous sports person, very often the best pointers I get aren't when we're on camera. We'll have done our pre-show, the match will be on, the commentator will be doing the commentary, and we're watching it in a studio. And I'll be next to it. Could be a Roy Keane, it could be a Shane Warne, rest in peace. It could be someone like that. And if they respect you and they're chatting with you, Alan Shearer or Andy Townsend or someone like that, then they'll be sort of saying, you see, what's difficult about that was he was doing this and that. And then I've never done that in my life. I don't have the skill to do that.
Yeah.
But once they've told me, then that becomes part of my armory.
Yes.
And I'm able to use that. But only once I've heard it from a pro.
Yeah.
I'm never going to stick my neck out and sort of just on my own volunteer. Well, we all know how tough that skill is.
Yeah.
No. And I think that's important. And I think the audience respects that. You're going, oh, right, okay, they're sharing something that they've learned, or he's sharing something he's learned about elite level sport.
Well, that's why I say to all my team, I say, look, if you're interviewing senior people, candidates, clients, what I find interesting is most people will take notes about the things they understand.
Yeah.
And I say, that's great, but you should be writing the things that you don't understand that are new to you. Go and study them and build that into your armory, as you said.
That's it, absolutely. You've got to grow. Everyone's got to grow. And I'm going to throw the Serena Williams thing at you right now, just whilst I remember. You mentioned it right at the start of our chat.
Yeah.
I interviewed her at the start of my career when I was covering all sports. I went to Hong Kong and there was a big tennis tournament on, and I interviewed Steffi Graf. I interviewed Anna Kournikova, who was very hot at the time in many ways, and she was famous and she was a good player, of course. It was a tournament of champions, but the Williams sisters were there and they were just starting out, so I got to interview all of them. Kournikova and Steffi were media trained, and they were very slick and very smooth, but they didn't really give you anything. Venus and Serena were brilliant because they were bubbly and bright, but Serena especially had this kind of inquisitive nature about her. And they spoke a little bit of Mandarin because they had a coach at the time who'd spent some time in Beijing and he'd been teaching them.
Wow.
And during the interview, she was saying to me, like, okay, well, do I use my Mandarin? I said, well, you're in Hong Kong, you need Cantonese. And I spoke a bit of Cantonese. So she said, come on then. So she asked me to teach, so I taught her a bit of Cantonese. Wow. And then somewhere in the interview, she used a long word in English. Yeah, quite a complicated word, a good word. And he used it, in the right place. And she stopped and she said, no, was that right? Was that an appropriate place to use that word? I can't remember the word.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, it's good. I said, why's that? She said, I'm learning. I try and throw a word in every day, try and learn a new one and bring it into a context. And I sat there and I thought to myself, that's done two things. That has humanized you.
Yeah.
It's shown your enthusiasm, what we call a growth mindset these days, this inquiring mind. What it's also done is it showed me a lot of respect. It's sort of said, look, I know you want something out of this interview. You don't just want, a vanilla kind of interview. I've given you something because I've engaged with the process and respected what you do. And again, that informs what I do. Yeah. Understand what someone's role in anything is and give them something. Empower them, show them respect.
Well, the thing is, you meet these icons and they probably have multiple interviews. And, it becomes probably a little bit boring for them, a bit bog standard. So I think one of the challenges for you is how do you make it unique? How do you make it different? How do you connect?
Well, what you do is a bit like you've done. You do your homework. That's important. That's an absolute must-have, right? But you can't over-obsess about your homework. I mean, the guy, for example, who's really great at this, do you watch Hot Ones on YouTube?
No.
Right. I can't remember the name of the guy, which is embarrassing, but he's a brilliant presenter. He does a show where he gets celebrities to come and eat
hot wings.
Oh,
I have seen it.
Right,
I have seen it.
it's
Yeah,
called
yeah,
Hot
yeah,
Wings,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
His degree and depth of research is amazing. And what happens is, very often you'll see his interview subject go, I didn't know anyone knew that. Good on you. And what he's done there is he buys their respect. He's earned their respect by the work he's done. So you have to have that. But what you also have to do is I think you have to show people that you're respectful, that you get them. And I find that in the course of my career with anyone, once they respect you, then they'll open up and they'll give you more.
Yeah.
And so I'll come back to sport in a minute, but back again to an early example, the Schwarzenegger one. I'm interviewing him at a junket. He's talking to tons of journalists, what have you. And there was something about, when I'd asked him, what have you, he suddenly became really engaging. He obviously respected the fact that I'd done a bit of research. He liked my line of questioning. We got on well. And I said to him, there are rumors that you're going to go into politics, Mr. Schwarzenegger, that you're going to leave showbiz behind and what have you. And he looked at me and he said, why would I do that?
Yeah.
Why would I do that? I get to go to exotic locations. I do the coolest stunts. I work with the most amazing, actors and actresses. And so why would I give all that up? And then he looked at me, paused a bit, and he winked.
I
thought, you've just given me something there. He didn't have to.
Yeah.
And that's it. Yeah.
Huge.
You have to realize that these guys are doing the same interview over and over. Make it interesting for them. Make it fun.
Yeah.
And you get something out of it.
Yeah.
And that's what the secret is. I love doing interviews for that very reason.
Who are the guys that you've sat down and spoken to that have, if you were to go back on your deathbed and say, look, these are 2 or 3 of the interviews that really stuck out?
In sport, let's do sport. In sport, I think Thierry Henry was one that was absolutely amazing. I used to do a show called Football Up Close. What we would do is me and a producer would fly to England, and we would normally do 2 match weekends where we would present live from the stadium into our pre-shows, which were from a studio in Singapore. But in the weekdays, we would travel around the country, going to clubs, and we would do sit-down interviews like this. Tough to get a lot of time with players, but we made it as a 24-minute show. Or it was a 30-minute show, but with adverts, 24 and a half minutes was our go-to. So if I could get the best part of 20 minutes or so, we could make a show. And trying to convince the clubs to give you players for 20 minutes was quite tough. But we did well. We got a lot of people. So we did everyone from Alan Shearer to Arsene Wenger to Gary Neville. That's a good story. I'll tell you in a minute. And we got Thierry Henry. I did Dennis Bergkamp as well. And they were in their pomp. They were the Invincibles. They were this brilliant Arsenal team.
Yeah.
Thierry was at that time maybe the best player in Europe, maybe in the world, best striker, I would say, in terms of what he was doing. He was flying. And so I thought, well, this is going to be a tough one. He's going to be, in demand. And he was. But he walked into an interview room at their London Colney training ground, sat down, and as is the case, you're in there, you've got the mics and cameras all set up, and you're ready to go, and we're putting mics on, and you do a little bit of ice-breaking small talk. And I'd noticed that he'd had a daughter, a baby daughter, with his partner not long previously. I have 2 girls. And I said to him, oh, okay. I said, girls are the best, aren't they? And he looked at me and went, yeah, they are, aren't they? And I said, I've got 2. They're beautiful. And I said, it's just incredible, and we spoke a little bit. And clearly, it struck a chord with him. It broke the ice. He was friendly and open. We got into the interview, and I thought I was going to get this standard interview about, his career and being a striker. But he suddenly started to give me things that were unbelievable. When I spoke about his childhood, he said, well, you and I were talking about daughters earlier on, but I want to talk about father-son relationships. He said, it's a very difficult dynamic. I had a difficult time with my father, particularly when you're showing promise in a sport. And he went into the dynamics of father-son relationships. At some point, he spoke about his upbringing, and he got into inner city, racially motivated problems in the Paris suburbs, which I was not expecting from the interview. And he spoke about racism, and he spoke about immigration. And
especially in France back then, right?
Yeah,
you remember
that's
how
right.
tough
And
it was.
look what happened subsequently.
Yeah.
And to have him talking about things like this, was just an amazing interview. And at one point, I glanced up over his shoulder, and my producer was in the background. My producer was just like,
this is gold dust.
This is amazing. We finished the interview. It was wonderful. He clearly got a lot out of it. He went around, he shook the hand of every single member of the crew.
What a gent.
And took a picture with me. Back in the day, in those days, we didn't take pictures. You know, it's crazy, Paul, to think these days in which we all want a selfie with everyone.
Yeah.
In those days, it was very much frowned upon to believe that you were anything other than just a journalist interviewing somebody. They're not your mate.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they have to take a picture with you. You're not a fanboy or a fangirl.
Yeah.
And only on the odd occasion would somebody say, hey, let's take a picture.
Yeah.
And it was special. So sadly, it means I don't have a lot of pictures from those days.
Isn't that mad?
But I have one or two.
Well, just to touch upon that, because fathers and sons, we've all got different relationships with their dads. And I heard this the other day, and it's on point. When you grow up thinking about your dad and your relationship, typically it starts off, you idolize him, you demonize him, and typically after he's passed away, you humanize him.
Yeah.
Interesting, right?
That's a great line. With my dad, who was this very driven, hardworking, never around guy, but he always supported me in everything I did. I loved it. Dad sadly passed way too early. He wasn't. He lived a banker's life, and he was a working class guy who suddenly got access to food and drink and didn't take care of his diet. And to an extent, that's why I'm very careful as I get older with how I take care of myself. And sadly, he suffered a high blood pressure and a stroke, and he left us when he was only about 70.
Wow.
So that's 22 years ago now, something like that.
Yeah.
But Dad retired when he was in Hong Kong and moved back to England, but he was still on the board of a couple of companies, and I was, enjoying my career in Hong Kong. And Dad would come back quite often for meetings there or in China or whatever it may be. And he came back, and suddenly it would be Dad would either come and stay with me or he'd be in a hotel, and we'd go out for a drink, and he became my friend. And he became my mate, and he shared with me, because by that stage I was working and earning money and learning about life, and he just shared things with me. And having been a father figure, sometimes a stern father figure, sometimes a distant father figure, but always there for me, he suddenly became my mate, and it was incredible. Humanized at that point. I'm so glad we had that, as I said, because he passed early.
Yeah, I'll start crying. But I watched the Rock's eulogy to his dad, and it was like, it's because your relationship is very complex. And with my son now, it's such a special relationship. And as you see, I'm 5'6.5". He's over 6 foot. He dwarfs me, and I'm so proud when I look at him. And it's just a beautiful journey, as you know.
It's wonderful. The best. I've written a lot of things in my life, and there are certain things I've been really proud of that I've done for magazines, newspapers, even for television. But the thing I wrote that I was proud of was the eulogy for my father.
Okay.
I flew over to England, obviously, the funeral and the service. And I researched it. I went back, spoke to his relatives, spoke to his early colleagues, what have you, and I charted his life from a coal mining town in Northumberland to his career, traveling the world, to all sorts of things. And I wrote it, and I read it, and I choked up as I read it. It was very hard to deliver it. And I look back at it, and I look at the original piece of paper with tears on it.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
And it was amazing. And it was the thing I'm most proud of.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a quick funny story. This will make you laugh. So I've had the privilege of going to watch some great sporting events, right? Unfortunately, not getting paid like you and enjoy. But that being said, you've got to do a lot of work, so you're not enjoying it in the same way, right?
It's different.
It's very different. I can only but imagine. So I went to, I think it was for the McGregor-Mayweather fight. Wow. And
I'm jealous. It's my turn to be jealous.
Well, so what happened was...
Although I have my misgivings about it as a contest.
Yeah. Actually, to your point, so what happened was I turned up and I thought it was my 40th. I booked the hotel and I booked some of the restaurants in advance. Yeah. And, you can cancel them without any recourse, no problem. Because I didn't know if I could get tickets. So I got tickets. So when I arrived, I said to my wife, I'm going to meet Mike Tyson on this trip. I feel it. And he was my favorite fighter growing up. Yeah. And sure enough, I'm walking down Las Vegas High Street and I can see that he's doing a signing in one of these sports shops. Yeah. And I turn up and there's like 150 people plus. And I go to the front. I said, is there any way I can get to the front? And they said, well, if you buy something over, I think it was $250, you get to the front of the queue. Yeah. I said, yeah, no problem. Right. So I'm there and they take pictures on their cameras, not your phone. And Mike's there and he's bored stiff, isn't he? And I'm thinking, what do I say? So I say, hi, Mike, it's a pleasure. I said, do you know where I can get a decent cigar? And he goes, well, where you stay? I was going to try and do his accent and put a list on, but I won't embarrass myself.
All right.
So I told him, well, I was going to Nobu, and he said, oh, just opposite Nobu in Caesar's Palace, there's a cigar shop there. Yeah. And then he goes, I might see you there later. I thought it was just a throwaway comment.
Right.
So I go into Nobu, and there's a lady, she's in her 60s, and she's standing, and I said, would you like to take my seat?
Yeah.
And turns around, and it's Jim Gray's wife.
Oh, wow.
And obviously, you know,
Explain Jim Gray, right?
yeah, so Jim Gray, color commentator, broadcaster, done everything like yourself.
Legend.
Yeah,
Genuinely legend, yeah.
Legend. And, you know, and for me, being a boxing fan, I've seen him in front of Mike Tyson when Mike Tyson was scary, and I always admired him for having the confidence to get in front of him. And so I said, oh, Mr. Graham, I'm a big fan. Who do you think is going to win? And he said, that's a stupid question, son. And he showed me a few clips that were going out later that night.
Yeah.
So then what happened was the place was buzzing. It was just full, and they didn't have a seat. And I was ushered to my table. I said, would you like to join me until your seat's available?
Yeah.
And they said, oh, that would be lovely. And he was so busy on his phone. He was quite happy that I was talking to his wife, and she was amazing. And he said, well, when our guests arrive, it's okay, we don't want to be rude, but we'll leave. And they did that, and they went and sat down, and it was with one of the owners of the NFL teams.
Wow.
Right. And I didn't know who it was. I had to look at it. And that's the thing, when you're ignorance can be bliss, right? So I wasn't overwhelmed.
Well, also, you treat them as a human being.
Exactly. So I left anyway, and I thought, I'll go and have a cigar now. So I'm in the cigar shop. Next thing, Mike Tyson walks past, and he comes in and he waves. And I'm thinking, he can't be waving at me, so I do this.
Yeah.
Sure enough, and he comes up, and he takes my cigar and goes, do you mind if I have a puff? And I said,
wow.
Mike, no, I'd rather you get your own one, or I'll get you one. I know where your lips have been. And he got a bit scared. He goes, where? And I said, Evander Holyfield's here. And he started laughing.
That is brilliant.
So he walked.
You took a risk there.
I took a risk. Yeah. I'd had too much to drink. So as he goes out, Jim Gray's coming out. They hug each other, and they turn back and they look at me, and they both wave. I thought it was surreal. Now, he's written a book, and I'm just curious, have you thought about writing a book?
That's a good question. People ask me that all the time. And now that I'm in this space where I'm sort of entrepreneurial and I'm coaching and training, what you do is, as you know, you put together your collateral, and your collateral involves your website, a bunch of brochures, 1 pages, 2 pages, whatever they may be. And people keep saying to me, right, and the other thing is podcasts. So with your permission, this will appear on my website along with others I've done. So that'll be a part of my portfolio. But people keep saying you need a book. So at some point I'll do it. And it's funny, really, because obviously people who come to it, let's say they're a sales coach or something like that, their book will be about sales coaching or personal branding.
Yeah.
I guess my one will be much more of a career book. Yeah. So I'll try and get around to that, but I'll try and focus it on where we are now. I don't want it just to be a kind of misty-eyed, rose-tinted lenses. Wasn't it great back then? So I think so. Just to your point, the story was a really good story, because what you've done is what I always set out to do. You humanize the person, and in so doing, that you give them a glimpse of, oh my goodness, okay, right, I don't have to tell that story about so-and-so. They're asking me about this. I'll give you a quick example of two people that taught me that lesson. Ryan Giggs and Gary Neville. Ryan Giggs, I was in South Africa in 2014, and funnily enough, I was working on the World Cup, which was in Brazil, but I was working for a South African broadcaster. So we did it out their studios in Johannesburg, and he came down. First ever time he'd been on TV, and he was a bit nervous about it all, never done it. So I sort of, was asked by his agent to sort of, buddy with him, and I did, and it was great. And we had a night off one night, and we'd been doing all the TV in the studio with a great cast of other pundits, Desai, Mendieta, Sami Kufor, JJ Okocha, Ryan. And then one night we were off, and they said, we're going to have this little drinks thing at a place in Sandton in Johannesburg. And we went in, and as we got there, the owners were falling over themselves. Oh, look, we got an area for you. And sure enough, there was like a velvet rope and a little thing like that. And we went up there, and me and Ryan sat there. And he looked at me, he said, I hate this. He said, all my life, all my career, I've been put behind the velvet rope. I don't want to be there. He said, John, I want to be with you. I want to go with you to the bar and sit and have a drink and chat with people. But he said, people always do this. And, I won't go into it here, but subsequently Ryan's had, a few issues in his life and what have you. But it stuck with me, and he really opened up to me, and he said, look, some of the happiest times in my life came when I was a young kid with the Wales team for the first time, and there was a bit of a drinking culture, because I just felt like I was one of the lads. Yeah. But otherwise, he said, I've always been taken away. Fergie, it wasn't a criticism of Sir Alex, protected him, took him away, and they never had that. Gary Neville, for example, when I went to interview him one day, I was sitting waiting to do an interview, and he was on the training ground, and he got a bang in the nose. And the PR person at Manchester United said, Gary won't be able to do the interview. He's got to go to hospital for a precautionary scan. Can we do it tomorrow? And we said, no, we're flying to Newcastle, or we're going to Newcastle or something tomorrow. We're away. And she said, well, sorry, that's it. And about a minute later, she came back in the room as we were packing up and said, Gary's just called, knows that you're got to go back to Singapore or wherever. He said, go to his flat.
Amazing.
Gary invited us down to Deansgate to this lovely apartment. He said, get there first. My partner will let you up. Set yourselves up. I'll get back from the hospital. And that again, is an example of somebody, works both ways.
Yeah.
It comes from you and me, and it comes from them saying, right, we respect what you're here for. We'll show a human side to us. And it's fun for us as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's when the media business is fun. When it's just purely contractual, you don't get great content out of it.
Yeah.
If it's sponsor driven, if it's just something that is done because of a contract, it's not great. When someone just opens up and goes, right, let's have some fun with this, let's work with this, then it becomes special.
Have you noticed, because in the US, most US athletes are media trained, right?
Yeah.
And the rest of the world, it's not the same. But what I've noticed is watching like Gary Neville, how his personality has come out since he's retired from football. And I just find like Alan Shearer, like he was, I remember when he was playing, he was the Iceman in many ways, right?
Yeah.
But now I love listening to him talk, and it changes.
They've had to learn. Gary was disliked. I went into that interview probably not expecting to like Gary very much. He had this, they called him the shop steward, didn't they?
Yeah.
And I know Peter Schmeichel quite well. And Peter Schmeichel used to look at me and go, oh, those Neville boys, they're so bloody busy. They're so busy. And he always used to go on about them like that. Gary just turned out to have a personality that was great. And his guard was up a lot, but when he let it down, he was good. Also, Gary is so methodical that when he was signed by Monday Night Football on Sky, he asked them to send a touchscreen to his place. He spent the summer practicing on the touchscreen. Because remember, doing live touchscreen can be pretty scary. I know I did it for years on the Premier League. He made sure that he was as good as he could be in the moment on that. Alan Shearer, he was very aloof at times, had to be be who he was. When he first started on Match of the Day, people said he was a bit wooden, but Alan's got a wicked sense of humor.
Yeah.
And that's started to come through. And it's nice now that he does stuff on the podcast and that, where you can see that.
Thierry Henry has a wicked sense of humor as well.
Oh, yeah.
He's fast. But I do think at the time is a lot of these guys, they're in that war zone and they know people want something from them. And I think it's almost like they change. I remember seeing Sampras play in a friendly against Federer in KL. I took my team, and there was some heckler in the crowd saying, that was rubbish. And Sampras, was known to be very wooden. He walked all the way up the stairs and said, do you want to have a try? And it was brilliant.
Yeah, brilliant.
Absolutely.
That's when sports elevated. When you get that either glimpse or they let their hair down.
Yeah.
Same with anything in life.
I think the thing is with sports, it is entertainment. So we all love people that do things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Talking about change and difference, tell us about your journey, about how you've gone from being a broadcaster to becoming an entrepreneur and setting up your own business.
Oh, wow. There's a lot to deal with there. I think what we have to do is we've got to accept there's an elephant in the room, which is that I was, for a period of years, maybe the most visible Premier League presenter in the world. And that's not a flex, that's just a fact, because I worked for the London-produced international content service for the Premier League. And I'd done that having already worked on an Asia-wide network in ESPN Star Sports. So I went from being highly visible to now not having that visibility. And I spend a lot of time with people coming up to me saying, oh, I miss you, where are you, what are you doing? We should go back to the Premier League, what's happening? The truth behind that one is, I suppose there are three major reasons why I am now not doing that. First one was I went to London to work on the Premier League's content service. But I've grown up in Asia. My roots are in Asia. My audience, to an extent, is in Asia. I love Asia. I love living, in particular, in Singapore. I'm a Singapore citizen now. That's how much it means to me. So I went over there. It was like a foreign posting. I loved the work. I loved the visibility. It got me, audiences around the world. But I realized that there was no future for me in the UK. As weird as this may sound, that content service does not appear. It's only made for international audiences. It does not appear in the UK. I had no presence or resonance within the UK market for audiences. Now, a lot of the producers and a lot of the talent who worked on BBC, ITV, Sky, BT, TNT, whoever it might be, they knew me because they'd come and work on the Premier League channel. And very often they'd be saying, man, you should be working on TV here. But what I found during my time there was, even though I was taken really good care of by the Premier League, who renewed my contract, and I ended up staying for 7 years, I couldn't get any work elsewhere. So even if I had a midweek off and I went to someone and said, hey, could I do your Champions League or could I do some stuff? I kept meeting this resistance, which was, well, people in this country don't know you, or you don't have an agent, which I didn't. So agents are very influential there. So I didn't have that kind of in with the right executives. But beyond that, I got to a point where ultimately someone turned around to me from one of the channels and said, look, your age and your gender are kind of counting against you.
Because they said that.
They said it to my face. And I'm not saying this from a point of bitterness or anything like that, because it's an acceptance that there was a movement towards far more inclusion and diversity in broadcasting. And, at least someone said it to my face. Yeah. It's like, it's not the right time for you to sort of start off building a presence. And also it would have been me building my reputation in the UK. It's not like I was someone who was known. So I realized maybe 2/3, 3/4 of my way through my time there that I probably wasn't going to stay. There were also other factors, which is I missed Asia, I missed Singapore. I love this place. And anyone who's lived here knows it's very hard to go and be in UK or US or somewhere else. There are things there that aren't as much fun as being here. So there was that. The other side of it was that when I came back here, I knew I was coming back into a market and an industry that had been heavily disrupted. The rise of streaming, the incredible amount of piracy that happens, all combined to make it very difficult for someone to put out a productive and profitable regional network. It just wasn't happening. So things shrunk a little bit. ESPN basically exited the market, apart from a bit of social and digital content. Star became Fox. Fox sort of didn't have the rights they used to have, didn't have Premier League and things like that, for example. But they came to me and said, look, do you want to come back? And I said, yeah, I do want to come back. So I spoke to a couple of really nice guys at Fox who said, look, come in and we can help each other. They said, if you come into this marketplace and bring your brand and bring your audience, we'll give you a show. And we won't just give you any show, we'll give you your show. Wow. So they gave me a show called The John Dykes Show. And the funny thing about that, Paul, is that, and I'm not doing this to sort of show that I'm a self-effacing guy, because my journalistic background, I'd never been one to put my name out there. Literally on screen, for many years, you would have never heard me say, hi, I'm John Dykes, or what have you. I knew there would be what we call a lower third graphic with my name on it. People knew who I was indirectly, but it didn't matter. My brand was associated with who I worked for. So it was ESPN, it was a show called Football Focus, which was our most famous show, a football chat show, which maybe we'll talk about in a minute. I could walk into a cafe, coffee shop, bar, anywhere from Jakarta to Manila to Bangkok, maybe Hong Kong. And even if a bunch of young kids didn't know me, they'd say ESPN or they'd say Football Focus, because the branding was so strong. But once I became, and then I was Premier League, I was Mr. Premier League. That's what they used to call me, the face of the Premier League, globally. When I came back, the guy said to me, we want you to do a football show. What should we call it? And we experimented with, we were going to call it the Full English, or we were going to call it the English Football Show. We're going to call it this. And then they said to me one day, every time we bring your name up in a meeting, someone says English football. So they said, we're going to call it the John Dykes Show because you've got the brand. So they gave me that. And it was great fun. Put the show out, chat show, no rights. So we were just talking. We had guests on. I used my connections to get good guests on. And it was more of I became a bit more opinionated. It wasn't just an interview show.
Before you started it, did you sit down with the executives and say, look, these are my ideas. This is the beginning, middle and end of what I want the show to look like?
It was very important that we had a sense of that it was going to be delivered across multiple platforms. By that stage, it was obvious that you couldn't just put out a TV show on the television. The old cable model wasn't, happening anymore. You had to have social media. So what we did, it had to be about engagement. So the idea was, we would put out something that would provoke engagement via our social platforms and at the Fox Sports Network. That would feed back up on itself, whereas feedback would come into the show, and we would make it a far more multi-platform, engaging product, whereby the audience was very much engaged. And that's hugely important these days. So we did that, and I loved it. And the affiliates bought into it. The sponsors came in. And we ended up doing things like a special around Liverpool finally winning the Premier League. We had that with Standard Chartered putting some money into it. It was really going well. And then, unfortunately, Disney bought the whole Fox global setup. They only wanted one or two bits of it, and they shut down pretty much all the Fox Sports channels, including ours. So I got to the point where, look, I'm back in Singapore. I'm a PR. This is home. But there isn't really what I would consider to be world-class regional, even broadcasting going on. There's bits and pieces. There's, of course, the possibility of doing something on YouTube or somewhere, but it would be a startup. And I'd spent 20 years building a name and a brand, and I didn't really want to have to start up again on a platform that I wasn't convinced would be easily monetizable. You know, when you've gone from earning a hefty chunk of cash every month, you know, to suddenly saying, well, I'm going to have to start off again, it didn't appeal to me. So I thought, okay, well, I'll carry on working for different clients. And I sort of found I was transforming in the way I worked. So a company in Indonesia, for example, had bought the rights to the Premier League. And although they could broadcast nationwide in Bahasa, they wanted to put out a premium English service, but they didn't know how to do it. So they said, look, could you come over and first create, conceptualize, produce, and deliver this, and also train our staff? So I did. I spent a year commuting every Saturday morning, up every Monday afternoon, back to Jakarta, where I got their studio set up. I taught them how to curate the amazing amount of content that comes in Monday to Friday from the Premier League. I taught them how to work on match day and train their producers in seeing stuff coming in, pulling it off the feed as it came in, turning it around and putting it out. I set the editorial agenda, and then I jumped in front of the camera and presented it.
It's a lot.
Which was actually the easy part for me.
Yeah.
But what was fascinating was effectively listening to the guys in my ear, figuring out as they went along, having spent hours that afternoon saying, look, this is going to come up tonight. When that happens, do this. Think about this as an editorial line. So the point I'm making is I found myself being seen more of a mentor. Even in commentary, I was doing some commentary recently, and the client said to me, look, we've got these really great commentators, but we'd like you to come in and maybe bring a little bit more structure to it and perhaps, you know, show and shape them a bit more. So increasingly, I found that in my broadcast space, people see me or have been seeing me as someone who could train. So I naturally thought to myself, well, why didn't I start delivering that to a broader audience? I've always spoken and I've always emceed and hosted, but it's been done on an ad hoc basis. Suddenly I had people come to me saying, well, there's a ton of voice and speech and presentation trainers out there, but you do it. You've lived it, you've learned it, and you live it. Why don't you actually do it? So now I'm out there working with people in the corporate world. I was working with an investment advisor recently who literally just came up to me and said, I pitch all day long. I talk to audiences. I'm trying to promote this fund manager, this market, but I could be better. What do I have to do? And I said, I'll train you.
Beautiful.
So I built a course out with this guy. I'm now developing that for other people. I'm looking to extend that. But I'm also now getting onto the stage a lot more in a more formal way. So to do all this, I realized I can't just do it as a kind of a every now and then ad hoc thing. I need to build a business around it. So I'm a solopreneur. I've got a website designed. I went to someone to deliver me some brilliant marketing collateral. I'm now learning. I'm reverse engineering this. I'm having to learn what the nuts and bolts are about pitching, about proposals, about follow-ups, about customer relation, about following up on leads. But more importantly, Paul, the single most important lesson I've learned is it's not about me saying, I can do this, come and get me.
Yeah.
It's about me going to people in L&D departments or talking to executives and saying, what do you need? What's the problem you need solving? What's the pain point, as we like to say these days? And how can I adapt something to that?
Yeah.
And for me, it's fascinating. I'm like a sort of, almost 60-year-old virgin in that regard. I'm like a born-again business, but I've never known anything about business or entrepreneur. I know it because it's in my background, but I haven't tapped into it.
Well, I think the thing that people don't realize when they go into business is, let's just pretend you are a contractor.
Yeah.
You get paid for doing the work, but the reality is, I don't know what percent, but let's pretend at least a third of your time is spent going out, writing proposals, meeting prospective clients, and only a small slither of it will come through. And one of the things that I talk to people about is training. Think about sales training. If your close rate conversion is 1 out of 10 proposals, and if you waste all that time, isn't it time well vested if you can increase that to maybe 8 out of 10 and get referral business on us? And that takes time. And then the thing that people don't realize is, so what you do takes a hell of a lot of courage, getting up, speaking to, iconic, famous people. But making a sales call, reaching out to somebody, that's not easy either.
I find that the difficulty for me as well is time management. You spoke about, getting one return on 10, for example. And I have to tap into what skills I might have. So I've found I have to be very careful not to go running off in pursuit of something that's either not going to lead to anything, or it's going to tire me out, or be just futile.
Yeah.
I have to try and focus my time and my resources on stuff that's actually got a purpose to it. And that's not something I've been very good at in the past. But what I've learned from my broadcasting career, it's a bit like prepping I'm doing a match commentary tonight in a football match. I'm not going to go in with that pile of notes that thick. I'm going to go in knowing what I need to know. And I've learned over the years that what you do is when you prep for something, you research smart. You anticipate what's going to come up and you learn what you need to learn. You don't go beyond that. Whereas some people pride themselves on having learned every single stat about this, that, and the other. It's never going to come up.
Yeah.
You've just filled your head up with stuff and you've wasted your time. So that's what I've got to learn. That's an important one. The other side of it is going to be, and what I find really hard is pricing. Because I never really negotiated contracts much. I had a bunch of really nice bosses who said, we're going to pay you that. And I thought to myself, seems pretty good to me. So when it comes to doing stuff, one of the hardest things I do is putting the value on my time and pricing it accordingly. And I keep getting told off by people in my industry going, you've undervalued yourself there, or you got this is how you should do that. But you just learn. You learn. And I'm learning from people. I've surrounded myself, and this is one of the key learnings. I have sought out mentors, trainers. I've paid people to do various bits and pieces, associations who can come to me and help me, and I can observe them. I go to meetings and watch these people do pitches and presentations. Yeah. One the other day was about scaling a business up. I don't intend to scale my business up, but along the way I learned some stuff. So I'm just learning.
You know what I find interesting is on my career coaching business, senior people completely understand what it takes to get to the top. They got to the top and they're still trying to aspire to get further, or not get knocked off. And they've got no money, no problem spending the money. And then I'll have other people that don't earn a lot of money and will say, well, that cost a lot. Yeah. I said, but if you invest in yourself now, this is what your future looks like. Yeah. So for example, in my company library, we've got 131 books, and I say to my guys, if I told you, if you read half of those books in the next 5 years, you're going to start making $1 million a year. Would you read it? Yeah, of course I would. Yeah. And I said, but there's no secret form. There's no absolute. But why don't you start reading those books? Yeah. And people just don't seek that wisdom. And
you've got to do the work, haven't you?
You have to put the work in. And what I always say to people is, when you become, you've been a very high black belt in what you've done for many years. And the reality is what you're doing is just a continuation of it. It's just opening the doors to getting that business in. Yeah, that's right. So I think that transition actually won't be too difficult, and it's exciting. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is when you started thinking about going to business for yourself, for those people that are exploring this idea, was it daunting, or was it a reality? I need to do this and I need to therefore lean into it.
Yeah. So I sort of spoke about this earlier on, and you can't kid yourself. In my case, I choose to live in Singapore. I choose not to be somebody who runs around bemoaning the fact that I can't get high-profile TV presenting jobs anymore. I do some work in broadcasting. I still commentate. I still pop up and do shows every now and then for people. But I was a little bit shocked when I was in the UK and in certain established markets because I always had the out. I always knew that I could come back to Singapore or go somewhere else in the world, what have you. I saw some people in the UK sports TV scene who were in this kind of, spiral of diminishing returns, who weren't getting the bookings anymore, who were getting bitter and twisted about it, who were letting it really eat them up. And it was horrible to see. And I vowed I don't want to be that person. I'm not going to spend the rest of my career just clinging on to still trying to do what I used to do, but not really getting as good gigs and not doing as good work. I couldn't. I'm too positive a person for that. But you have to acknowledge that there will come a time in your career when you've got to say, right, okay, am I going to be that person, or am I going to be someone a bit more front foot but proactive? So I see it as a pivot and an evolution. And it's very important to say, right, what I have been will inform what I'm not. It's not a handbrake turn. You're not suddenly discarding 20, 30 years of experience and knowledge. You're saying, I'm doing this now, and I'm going to dig into elements of what I've been to make me what I can become. And I'm finding so many things that resonate in terms of the prep I do, the ability to have confidence that I can do this. You spoke about it being daunting. When you sit in a press conference, or as I did back in the 2000s, and Sir Alex Ferguson in his pomp was holding a press conference, and you'll have seen this, if a journalist, even if they asked an okay question, but he just didn't want to answer it, he could eviscerate that journalist.
Yeah.
He could tear him apart on camera with a bunch of sycophantic journalists all chuckling away at this and what have you.
Yeah.
And he can make you feel very small. It's not a slight on him. He had a focus on what he wanted to do, and he controlled and owned the media in the way he wanted to. That was how he operated.
Yeah.
But boy, you needed to know your stuff. You needed to think, right, what am I asking? Is this going to work? I'm not going to bow down, but I'm going to ask a question that I think will get the right answer. That's daunting. Going on TV, about to present a major final or a major match. And I've been on TV when sell-ons happened around into the China market. I think we did a game once where there was a Manchester City team with a China player, Sun Jihai, against an Everton team with Li Jie, a China player, and it was sold on. Someone told me that our audience was close to 1 million. You know, when you're on live TV,
it's amazing.
And when I do live matches, I don't work off a running order. I don't work off, an auto cue. I work off a running order. So I don't have the words written.
What is a running order?
A running order is the structure, the flow of the show.
Okay.
And it's for everybody who works on the broadcast. This is the item we're going to do. This is where the sound is going to come from. This is where a graphic might come in. So it's the flow of the show. The flow of the show is what dictates what we do. But I don't have a teleprompter running a script.
Yeah.
What I do is I rehearse.
Yeah.
Rehearse really, really seriously. I worked under a great director in England, probably the best studio director around football in England. And his theory was this: every pre-show you do twice as much rehearsal. 45-minute pre-show, you do an hour and a half rehearsal.
Wow.
And what that rehearsal does is it gets the whole team attuned to where we're going, what's going to happen next, who's going to push what button, who's going to fade up, what have you. And in my case, what are my words going into this package, this item? So he knows when to. It just makes the broadcast better. Again, that I tap into that now when I'm confronted by, today I've got to make a call. Today I've got to figure out how to do this. Today I've got to go and coach somebody, or I'm going to get on stage and speak. I go through my processes. Am I ready for this? Have I done it before? Do I know? Have I anticipated what I need to do? It's the same thing, just applied differently.
It's hugely important. I mean, my son wants to be a filmmaker, and I introduced him to the original Karate Kid, and now Cobra Kai's out.
Oh, I love it.
He loves it. And he and I found a rehearsal of the whole movie shot in a warehouse. And it's like watching the movie. And I had done it so many times, and you could see why that movie was so successful, because it was so well rehearsed.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your coaching. So dealing with things like crisis management, executive coaching, mastering the art of getting on the stage, delivery.
Yeah.
You know, talk to me about how you work with your clients.
So I'm at the point where the journey is really starting in terms of the coaching. But as far as getting on stage, that's already happening. So I will get on stage, and I'm building some keynotes out that I think will be, the keynote will be like the Grand Slams, won't they? You know, because effectively I'd like to do what I'm doing in front of individuals or groups of people. And every now and then someone might say, why don't you get on stage and talk about it? It could be about my career transition. It could be about communication. But if we break them down, everything starts and ends with the communication side of things. So I think at the heart of what I'm going to offer, or what I am offering already, is storytelling. In terms of finding the story, that's my journalistic instinct, crafting and shaping the story, how you then deliver it in terms of hooking the audience attention or your client's attention, engagement with them, making sure that you deliver this engagement, that you read nonverbal cues, that you have your own nonverbal gestures that work. So there's all of that happening, and that underpins everything I do, because effective communication in any circumstance is at the root of everything. It could be in crisis management, for example. You're confronted by something. When you work in sport or live broadcasting, everything is a crisis because it's unscripted. Anything could happen, which means that your preparation, your confidence, your lines of communication within your team, your second guessing of what might happen, and therefore contingency planning is there. And above all else, the confidence. I mentioned a thing called a running order or a rundown. The audience doesn't have one.
Yeah.
They get what they get.
Yeah.
And if you deliver what you deliver in a smooth fashion that looks as if it was planned all along, they're none the wiser. And that speaks to some of the stuff I do in that space. Just building people into a position where things are going to happen, but you're prepared for it.
I wanted to ask you, maybe you're going to give away your trade secrets, but do you have things that are prepared in your pocket? So, like they think it's all over. It is now. Do you think that was pre-prepared or?
That wasn't pre-prepared, no.
Because that was
but
so
nowadays,
at the moment.
Now, yeah, it was. I mean, no, because that could only have come organically because he didn't know.
He didn't know.
He didn't know people were going to run on the pitch, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about Kenneth Wolstenholme there, 1966 World Cup final. It's a really interesting point you make, and I'm just going to go back to Cobra Kai and rehearsal. Rehearsal is absolutely fundamental, and what I say, and I build something out on this. This is something that I want to talk to everybody about, and I think anyone who's listening to this should want to hear this. I rehearse hard to earn the right to be spontaneous.
I love that.
Think about that.
It's very powerful.
And I'll explain that. You do the rehearsal so that what you deliver isn't over-rehearsed or stale or flat. You rehearse, and every part of your team rehearses so that you then deliver something that's even better than you planned it because you're doing it spontaneously, secure in the knowledge that you know where you are, where you're going, what's happening. That's important. On predetermined commentary, I have a bit of a theory and a bit of an issue with that right now. It's risen with the rise of the shoutcasters, with the soundbite culture, with social media. So what's happening now, and this is no slight to those who do it, but we've gone from a period where you had commentators who had a great voice, who had a great sense of the occasion, who worked in the now, to those who've prepared lines. And sometimes there's one I know who at the start of a match, and it's obviously he's prepared this and he reads a little speech out no matter what's going on the pitch or what have you. Yeah. And you think to yourself, it's a bit too prepared. By all means, set the scene for something. And I think this is where I talk about organic delivery all the time. Set the scene, but respond to what you're seeing because it's an organic moment. That's you might be charging off on your line about when two giants of this meet each other, it's like jousting, and then suddenly a brilliant shot comes up. Are you going to ignore that shot? No, you got to be organic and work it in. So what I find now is that there's a generation of youngsters who are saying, oh, we don't like that commentator because he's too flat. We like the one who shouts those lines. Now, obviously, Peter Drury is very good at that, but Peter's more than just that. Peter does it for 90 minutes.
Yeah.
But people like to pick out it, use that sound bite, because these days we chunk everything up into little bites, don't we? But I met someone a while back who was a shoutcaster on esports, and they thought that all they had to do was go, blah, 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 blah. Oh, that's crazy. And they go, yeah, but that's all that people care about is my one line where I've come up with this crazy. And I go, yeah, but you got to commentate as well.
Yeah.
You can't just be remembered
and
for
that. Was specifically for esports, was it?
It was an esports one. And so I say esports because it meant it was coming from a generation that has risen up with sound bites being really important and catchphrases.
You know what was funny? I'm still a massive sprint fan. So 1992, when Mr. Christie won the Olympics, my dad always had us, he's a builder, always helping him do work at the weekend.
Oh, yeah.
And I just said, Dad, please, whatever happens, can we get back in time to watch the final?
Yeah.
And then he said, I'll do you one better. We'll get the semi-final and the final. We were in Greenford outside of Fish and Chippy listening to it on the radio. And I was just horrified. But I remember David Coleman saying, next to Linford Christie's Leroy Burrell, he's blind in I can't even, he said if it was his left eye or his right eye, so Linford can't see him. And then he was gone to his notes and he said, actually, he's blind in the other eye, so Linford will be able to see him. And I was thinking, that was authentic. And it made me chuckle. It was great. It was brilliant.
And that's the thing. I mean, we spoke about humanizing it earlier on. The other thing I talk about is, and people identify this in me, and it's funny because you do a thing like this, you don't want to give away your trade secrets, but one thing I talk about is being in the now. And I was chatting with a guy yesterday who I really respect. He's been working in the speaking space for a long, long time. And he said to me, he said, when I think about you, John, I think about one thing. And I said, what's that? And he said, you're in the now. You work in the now, in the present. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, when you're doing an interview with someone, you listen to the answer. And you don't just listen, you pick up on what they say, and then you tailor what you've got, you respond, you bring the audience in, and it becomes something that actually is progressive rather than just a I speak, you speak, I speak, you speak, which you see so often at presentations or what have you. And I thought about it and I said, yeah, that's really at the heart of what I do. And one of my ex-bosses noted that. I interviewed him once. He was actually in charge of the company I work for and happened to be he said, now I figured out what you do. He said, unlike so many people, you listen. And you'll know this. presenters and broadcasters are a vain breed. Let me tell you that. You might have guessed it already. And there's a lot who are so obsessed about how they look and sound that they have their list of questions. And once they've asked the question, they don't listen. They switch off. They're sitting there going, okay, how am I going to look good asking the next one? Now, the interview subject might actually give you a juicy half volley of an answer that needs to be smashed, but they miss it because they're not even listening. They're too busy thinking about how great they're going to look when they phrase their next question. You take that half volley, you smash it, you bring the audience in, you then follow up with another question. And the reason I say this is what you've created is a unique moment for you, that person, the audience, that was only available to people in that time, in that place, because you made it unique.
Yeah. Funny enough, you talk about this. So I feel when people are having interviews or they're making presentations, they're so busy focused on what they're going to ask, what they're going to say, that they're not listening to what the person's saying.
Precisely what I'm saying.
Yeah, and that's a real challenge.
So I've given away something there, but in a way, you need me to tell you how to do that.
Because that's huge.
That's very, very important. And that elevates every interview, TV show, podcast, panel discussion, fireside anyone ever does. And that's effectively, according to my mate, that's what I bring.
Let me ask you some things, if you don't mind, about how you keep your mind so sharp and active and fast. Because you picked me up on Barry Norman, right? You I hadn't thought about him for a long time. Let's talk about what we talked about before in our very first discussion, something that we both love, which is exercise and sport.
Yeah.
Diet, sleep, coffee, because when you're going on, you're on every day, you've got to be on your game.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about your diet in terms of all of that?
I mean, the main thing is high performance.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a buzzword and a bit cliched these days because you see it applied everywhere. But one thing I've discovered is that you have to be putting yourself in a position to perform at the very best you can. Trust me, I wasn't the best at that. When I was a teenager, I was a late developer, but I became a really good athlete in terms of I was running track and running good times at 400 meters, and I played all sorts of sport. And then sadly, I went to university and I got into all the bad habits, with drinking and what have you. And even though I still played a lot of sport, I never really took care of myself. And I don't think I took care of myself for about 30 years. Going into journalism as a young man, back in the days when it was a hard drinking career.
Yeah.
And I had a dispensation towards that anyway. Again, I got into in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Bloody hell, Hong Kong, what a place to be.
Forget about
journalist, Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, I wasn't always the best. But because the job I did, I could turn up to interview you, but I'm not on camera. If I'm just writing in a notebook, I could be a bit hungover, not my best, what have you. But I knew that by the time I sat and wrote, I'd come up with something good. So I kind of for years, but then I started appearing on television, and straight away, as soon as I appeared on TV, you can't go on TV looking rubbish, and a vanity thing means you want to try and keep yourself as good as you can. But I was blessed to meet and marry a beautiful woman who's very, very good with diet. Takes care of herself, doesn't drink, doesn't mind me drinking at all or what have you. But we eat sensibly. She likes me to be, she's 7 years younger than me. So she kind of wants me to be, fit and healthy as much as possible and look as good as I can. So combined with my career being something I took extremely seriously, and that I naturally tried to take care of myself. But then I went to another level about 7 years ago when I met, and I'll give a shout out to my personal trainer, John Wilkinson here. He's a great trainer. He's an ex-pro footballer who came to Singapore, played for Singapore, naturalized, in fact became a Singaporean. But he's also a real student of everything to do with physiology and psychology. And he pulled me a few years back and sort of said, look, come and train with me. Because he said, I know that, you think you keep yourself in shape and everything like that. But he said, I see something in you that I think I could really work with. And so we started working together. And he said, the other thing as well is you are in a highly competitive field. You're in a stressful field. I've seen you work. You're in a job where you have to be laser sharp. I keep hitting the mic. It's very amateurish. Laser sharp and focused for long periods of time. And that's true. If I was doing a 3-match Premier League Saturday, I might go on air UK time, 12 noon, first game 12:30, go through to 8:30 at night, having to be at it live all the way. And I found, and I have discovered, that thanks to working with him, I can, in terms of my mechanical skills, if I work out earlier in the day, I find that later in the day when I need it, I can tap into that energy. I can just switch it on again, and I can just kick on again, and it keeps me sharp. But also it means that I'm clean, I'm light, I feel good. When you're doing something, you don't want to go into it heavy and sluggish.
Yeah.
So I feel sharp and light and at it. The other thing, in a broader sense, is I've learned resilience. A lot of the training I do, I used to be a runner, but in 97, 98, I wrecked my left knee badly playing football. I ruptured the ACL and the lateral collateral. Huge rehab, nasty. The graft that I had put in failed about 8 years later, another reconstruction. So I'm walking around on a knee that's buckled and bent and what have you. So no more long distance running. But when I train resistance training, and I do circuits, and I train for functional durability, really. So I've done Spartan races, which I loved, and I can just about limp around 5K. I love it all. I love the fact you go from heavy to that, and it's about gritting it out.
Yeah.
So I work to be durable and resilient, and that works outside of the gym, in my life, in my career, in taking on what's happened. I've been able to, and this comes with sleepless nights and financial stresses.
Yeah.
What I do is I train, I tap into that, going, if I can get through this bloody workout, which is tough, and I work out really hard.
Yeah.
And we do, and I'll be 60 this year.
You look fantastic, John.
Oh, thank you. I'm not fishing for compliments.
No.
I regularly set the best times in the gym on challenges that we do. And it might be a 35-minute challenge where you're grinding from circuit to circuit. It's
amazing.
Putting some doggy runs in and burpees and stuff like that. And John says to me, it's because you're durable. You don't give up. You keep going. They might be a bit quicker or explosive, but you set the best times because you just maintain. And that's what I try and do in life.
And that longevity is coming through, right? It's huge.
And here I am. I'm starting a new thing. And like I said, 60 is just a number. I'm in no hurry to do anything other than build a business and work at it for as long as it takes, the next decade or so. So
talk to me in terms of the next projects. What's imminent? What are some of the things you want to be working on?
Well, yeah. So the broadcast, funnily enough, broadcast work still comes to me. So World Table Tennis have been hiring me recently to go and commentate on their WTT tour, which is great fun. They've taken table tennis and made it really fun. Jazzed it up, made it bright and colourful.
It's great to watch, isn't it?
It's great to watch. I love table tennis, and I hadn't done a lot of table tennis commentary, but I used to do multi-sports. So I worked on all sports, from tennis to golf to Formula One to football and rugby. So I'm comfortable with anything, and so I've loved doing that. F1 recently, I was doing a bunch of hosting, but in a corporate sense, and I loved that. I did something for Marina Bay the other night. I got on stage at the Sky Park at MBS, and I interviewed Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc and Fred Vasseur, the team principal, and that's great. So I like the fact that my broadcast work and journalism has taken me into that space, but now I'm all about what I'm building now, and I'm so excited about it because now that I'm talking to people like you and other people in that field, they're saying, oh boy, this is going to be fun.
Oh yeah.
So if I can get the work done, and boy, I'm working hard on the back end stuff. I've got all the stuff in place. I'm already going out and already speaking and stuff. I really want to share what I know with as many people as possible. I want them to get as much enjoyment as I have done out of taking sporting lessons and examples and applying them to their lives and their businesses and their own careers. And I really just want to build that out in as many ways as I can. And then share it, because I'm a front foot guy, and I've got so much from it. I don't want people to get something from it.
Well, look, I've got a few rapid fire questions, if I may. So talk a little bit about your key journalistic inspirations. Who are the key people that you've looked at and thought, I want to follow those guys? They're great.
Okay, I started off as a writer. So people like the great Hugh McIlvanney, who was a great long read kind of guy, inspires me. I love reading people like Gabriele Marcotti, Barney Ronay, who take sport and turn it into something magical. So I'm really into that. Journalistically, I mentioned broadcaster. I mentioned Richie Benno earlier on in terms of what he taught me. The great football commentators, and Andy Gray as a color commentator. Yeah, okay, forget what happened in terms of why he left Sky. I think co-commentary is not as good as it was when he was doing it. He knew, particularly working with Martin Tyler, to do that thing I spoke about. Interpret something, bring more than just describing what happened, answer a question that's forming in the viewer's mind.
Love it. Favorite football club and why?
I don't support a team. Many people will be amazed to learn this one, but I did when I was a kid go and watch Ipswich Town a lot. It was the nearest club. My dad was a Geordie. Bobby Robson was manager. Dad said, let's go and watch them. They were a lovely family club. You could get in there almost any time you wanted to. And I would go there to watch the other big teams come and play there. But I developed a real affection for them as a club. But I never really became a hardcore supporter. If pushed, I would say, yeah, they're a team I follow. But it would be a lie of me to say that I followed them closely for years. So I like Ipswich.
Well, listen, it's good. You've got to be a bit neutral in your job, right?
Yeah, and that helped. And as I went in my career, I found I don't like being a fan, by the way.
Okay.
People go on about the angst of it. I don't like that. I didn't like what it made me feel if I was trying to be a fan. So I genuinely can watch any sport without taking sides.
Love it. Favorite sportswoman and sportsman, A, to watch, and B, to interview?
I think I mentioned Thierry Henry. The Irish don't like him because of the handball, understandably. But when he was in his flow, the way he moved, as a runner, I always loved it. Cricket, I watched Michael Holding, the fast bowler, because his approach to the wicket and his delivery was beautiful. And I always felt that someone who could move nicely, Ed Moses, I loved that kind of person. Woman, I like anyone who has had to fight, grow. Serena Williams would be there. Just in terms of somebody who came from a position where they worked hard and have made something of themselves and then just kept winning and I like someone who doesn't win once but just knows how to win again and again and again, because that means that they're special.
Yeah, indeed. Most memorable interview of your career?
That would be the Thierry Henry one in terms of sport, but I was lucky not to always work in sport, and that informs what I do. I interviewed Tim Burton once, just after he did A Nightmare Before Christmas, something like that. The Nightmare Before Christmas. I just love talking to people from all walks of life, and he just took me in areas that I like being stretched musically and otherwise, and I really enjoyed interviewing him.
Beautiful. Premier League or Champions League? Which is more exciting to cover? To cover,
probably Premier League, because I've done it for so long. And I felt that with the Premier League, there was always this kind of urgency. Champions League is this thing that, because I'm in Asia, it happened in the middle of the night. I don't like getting up in the middle of the night. Premier League's more viewer friendly. But in all honesty, I like the crowd engagement, and I like the vibe and the buzz around Premier League.
Most starstruck moment? Because you've interviewed a lot of people, right?
Goodness. Well, probably coming face to face with Alex Ferguson. That was a bit scary. But in terms of legendary people, it's always the ones that you've idolized growing up, I suppose. Or even not growing up, but watching Shane Warne.
Okay.
Shane Warne. I found myself in a position where I sat with Shane Warne and had a couple of drinks one night in Kuala Lumpur.
Oh, just beautiful.
Go, oh my goodness, what am I doing here? Pinch myself.
Amazing. I know you've had a few of these, but toughest moment during a live broadcast?
Toughest moment might be tech. Tech's the thing that can let you down.
Yeah.
I was doing an FA Cup final once from Wembley, and we lost all communication. So we were still on air, but no one could talk to me. And all I had to do was remember where we were supposed to go roughly and kind of just deliver a show without anyone able to actually communicate with me. Live on air, standing on a pitch, not even in the studio in my comfort zone, broadcasting to Asia, miles away. That sort of thing's scary. And you just deal with it.
Yeah, it is tough. I can only but imagine. What is the one trait that you think all successful presenters really need to have if you were to choose one?
Humility. It's not about you. It's about the broadcast.
Love it. You might have answered this earlier, but best career advice you've ever received?
Actually, I'll give you another story. It's a little bit of a story. Sell yourself well and reach. And the example, the reason I say that is, before I moved into sports broadcasting as a broadcaster, I was working as a producer. There was an opportunity to go to work at Star, and the guy who was interviewing me sort of said, look, I've heard you're interested in coming to work here. What do you do? And I sort of said, well, I'm a producer and I'm a presenter. And the guy was no nonsense. He sort of said, well, what are you? And I was on a speakerphone. My boss ran in from the next office, and he put his hand over. He said, you're a presenter, you bloody idiot. and I said, well, I'm a presenter. All right, come and talk to us then. And my life turned from then, took off, my career took off, all because a guy had the generosity to say to me, sell yourself, reach for something.
That's very powerful. And it's profound, right? It's very simple, but to the point.
Yeah.
What do you miss most about full-time football commentary?
I don't. I've done so much of it. I don't miss it.
Really?
Tonight I'm going to go and commentate on a Southeast Asian Shopee Cup match. I've got a commentary coming up actually the weekend to do some local Singapore Premier League, and it's lovely to get in front of the mic and do it occasionally. But I did so much of it in the past, presented so many matches that I'm more excited about doing what I do now, doing something differently.
I love it. So looking forward to what you're doing now, thus far, what's been the most rewarding part of, becoming an entrepreneur, keynote speaker?
The most rewarding part was training somebody who came back to me and said, yes, that thing you told me to do, I did it and it was great and it's working. And ultimately, if it's working for him, that means he's making more money or his clients are making more money.
Yeah.
And that's now what it has to be about for me.
I believe, subscribe to, and I always have done, is a rising tide raises all ships.
Yeah.
And it, that guy will do well. He'll speak well of you, more referral business.
Yeah.
John, I've been watching you for years and you were so kind when I called you. It's been a real great pleasure. I'm looking forward to doing a lot of collaboration with you in the future. Is there anything that you want to say to wrap up?
Well, I think, Paul, what I would say is this. I love the field that you're in. And now that I'm beginning to learn about careers and career transition and what have you, the more people like you that are around, the better. And I said this earlier on, but I have learned, I'm a team sports player. And therefore, when I was in big broadcast teams, I loved it. And I was a bit lost for a couple of years, missing it. Sitting at home, back-ending stuff, being on my own, not having those engagements that I loved. What I've started to do now on my journey as an entrepreneur is I've reached out to people and people have come to me and I'm building these lovely communities and relationships now. And that, I think, excites me more than anything right now. And you're part of it.
I love it. John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.